My husband claimed his work wife was an upgrade, so I let him find out if she was worth it. My husband Craig came home from his office Christmas party drunk and talkative, going on about how lucky he was to have Jessica as his work wife. He said she understood him better than I ever could because she knew his professional side, his ambitions, his real personality. He actually said his real personality, like the person he was at home with me for 8 years, was fake. He kept listing all the ways Jessica was superior to me. She laughed at all his jokes while I was too serious. She dressed professionally while I wore yoga pants at home. She brought him his favorite coffee every morning while I expected him to make his own. She remembered every work milestone while I forgot to ask about his presentations. She understood spreadsheets and could talk about quarterly reports while I worked as a kindergarten teacher and talked about finger painting. He said having Jessica at work made him realize what he was missing at home. When I asked if he was having an affair, he laughed and said, work wives weren't about sex, they were about emotional connection, which was somehow worse. He said Jessica fulfilled the intellectual and emotional needs I couldn't meet. He passed out on the couch after saying maybe he'd married the wrong type of woman. I spent the night thinking about those words. The next morning, Craig didn't remember the conversation, but I did. Every word. I started paying attention to how often Jessica came up in conversation. It was constant. Jessica thought his idea was brilliant. Jessica said his tie brought out his eyes. Jessica laughed so hard at his story she cried. Jessica stayed late to help with his project. Jessica, Jessica, Jessica. Then I met her at Craig's company picnic. She was exactly what I expected. 25, fresh from business school, hanging on every word from married men while ignoring the single ones. She called Craig her work husband in front of me and laughed like it was adorable. She knew things about our life I'd never told her, like what we argued about, my miscarriage last year, how much we spent on our mortgage. Craig had told his work wife everything about our real marriage. When I confronted Craig, he said I was being insecure, and Jessica was just a friend who happened to be female. He said work spouses were normal and I was overreacting. He said Jessica made his work life bearable, and I should be grateful she kept him happy at the office. He actually said I should thank her for making him not dread Mondays. That's when I decided to give Craig exactly what he wanted, a choice between wives. I called Jessica and invited her for dinner to thank her for being such a good friend to Craig. She accepted immediately, probably thinking she'd won some competition. During dinner, I was perfectly pleasant while asking innocent questions. How did she afford her apartment on an entry-level salary? She said Craig had co-signed her lease as a favor. How did she get to work since she didn't have a car? Craig drove her most days since they lived in the same direction. How did she pay for all those expensive work lunches? Craig covered them and she'd pay him back eventually. Who helped her with her workload when she fell behind? Craig stayed late to help because that's what work spouses do. After dinner, I presented them both with a proposition. Since Craig felt Jessica was better suited to his needs, and since they were already basically married at work, they should make it official. I would file for divorce, citing emotional infidelity. Craig could marry Jessica, and everyone would get what they wanted. Craig laughed, saying I was being ridiculous, but Jessica's face lit up. She said it wasn't the worst idea, that Craig did complain about me constantly, and they were more compatible. Craig went pale when Jessica eagerly agreed that this could work. I pulled out the divorce papers I'd already had drawn up. My lawyer had included everything, splitting assets, selling the house, and dividing retirement accounts. Half of everything Craig had worked for would be gone. Then I showed them the prenup template for their future marriage, protecting Jessica's assets from Craig, just like he'd lose half to me. Jessica's enthusiasm dimmed when she saw that Craig would leave our marriage with half his current worth, and she'd be starting fresh with a middle-aged man with financial obligations. I also showed them my resignation letter to Craig's company HR department, detailing their inappropriate relationship, the financial arrangements, and the emotional affair conducted on company time. The co-signed lease, the daily rides, and the covered lunches all violated company policy about manager-subordinate relationships since Craig was senior to Jessica, even though she wasn't his direct report. They'd both be fired immediately. Craig tried to backtrack, saying work wives were just a joke, that Jessica meant nothing. Jessica's jaw dropped. She said Craig complained about me constantly. She said they were more compatible. The words hung in the air while I stacked the papers, sliding them back into the folder with steady hands. Craig's mouth opened and closed like he was trying to find words that wouldn't make everything worse. Jessica's eyes went from Craig to me and back again, waiting for someone to say this was all a joke. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the floor loud enough to make them both flinch. I thanked them for coming, my voice polite like I'd just hosted a book club instead of laying out the end of my marriage. Craig started to stand, but I was already walking toward the hallway, folder tucked under my arm. The guest bedroom door clicked shut behind me, the lock turning with a solid sound that felt final. I sat on the edge of the bed I'd made up earlier with fresh sheets, listening to the silence downstairs stretch out longer and longer. Their voices started maybe 20 minutes later, harsh whispers that carried up through the vents. I couldn't make out full sentences at first, just the angry rhythm of two people who'd stopped pretending to be on the same side. I moved closer to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Jessica's voice came through clearer now, sharp and accusing. Craig said something back, his tone defensive and panicked. The words started separating into phrases I could actually hear. She said he told her I was insecure, that I didn't understand him. He said he never promised her anything, that she was reading too much into their friendship. She said this was his fault for involving her, for making her think there was something real between them. Their alliance was breaking apart right there in my living room, all the casual intimacy they'd built crumbling under actual consequences. I pulled out my phone and texted Lila, asking if I could stay at her place tomorrow because I needed space to think. She responded immediately with her address and told me to come whenever I was ready. Morning came with Craig knocking on the guest bedroom door before I'd even gotten dressed for work. His voice filtered through the wood, softer now, saying we needed to talk. I opened the door still in my pajamas, arms crossed, waiting for whatever script he'd rehearsed overnight. He said we could fix this, that Jessica meant nothing, exactly the words I'd expected to hear. His face looked tired, like he hadn't slept, and part of me felt satisfied that he'd spent the night uncomfortable while I'd locked myself away. I told him I was staying at Lila's for a few days, that he needed to decide what he actually wanted, because I was done being dismissed and disrespected. He reached for my arm, but I stepped back, telling him not to touch me right now. His hand dropped and he nodded, looking smaller somehow in the morning light. I grabbed my work bag and left without breakfast, pulling out of the driveway while he stood in the doorway watching me go. My phone buzzed 3 times before I even made it to the school. Jessica's texts came through one after another, each message more desperate than the last. The first one asked if I was really going to file the HR complaint. The second one said she was sorry if she'd misunderstood the situation. The third one begged me to call her so we could talk about this like adults. I deleted all 3 without responding, focusing on the kindergarten classroom waiting for me where finger paint and story time had nothing to do with work wives or emotional affairs. The kids didn't care that my marriage was falling apart. They just wanted to show me their drawings and tell me about their weekend adventures. Lila's apartment smelled like vanilla candles and the lasagna she'd made for dinner. She opened the door and pulled me into a hug before I'd even set down my overnight bag. We ate on her couch with plates balanced on our knees, and somewhere between the second and third glass of wine, I started crying. Not the quiet tears I'd held back all day, but ugly, gasping sobs that made my whole body shake. 8 years of marriage ending this way, because Craig decided Jessica understood spreadsheets better than I understood him. Lila held me while I cried, rubbing circles on my back like I did for my kindergarten students when they scraped their knees at recess. She reminded me that I didn't cause this, that Craig's choices and Jessica's willing participation created this situation. When I finally stopped crying enough to breathe normally, she asked the hard question I'd been avoiding. Did I actually want the divorce, or was I just trying to scare them into understanding consequences? The next 2 days blurred together in Lila's spare bedroom, sleeping late and thinking about what I actually wanted instead of what Craig deserved. The truth sat heavy in my chest every time I tried to imagine going back to normal. I wasn't sure I could ever trust him again after hearing him call me too serious, after learning he told Jessica I didn't understand his real personality. Lila helped me see what I'd been trying not to admit. Even if Craig ended things with Jessica completely, the fundamental disrespect he'd shown me revealed how he really felt about our marriage. He'd spent months making me feel crazy for being uncomfortable, dismissing my concerns while building emotional intimacy with someone else. That didn't just go away because he got caught and panicked about consequences. Craig called 6 times the first day, 9 times the second day, each call going straight to voicemail. I let him sit with the uncertainty the same way he'd made me feel insecure for months, while Jessica's name came up constantly in conversation. On the 3rd day, Ambrosia called from her office. Her voice was professional and calm, telling me Craig had contacted her asking about the divorce papers and whether I was serious. I told her I needed a few more days to decide, but to proceed with initial filings anyway, to show Craig I wasn't bluffing. She said she'd handle it and reminded me not to communicate directly with Craig while we figured out next steps. After we hung up, I felt both relieved and terrified, like I'd just jumped off something tall without checking how far down the ground was. Jessica's car was parked next to mine when I walked out of the elementary school at dismissal. She leaned against the driver's side door looking exhausted, dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't been sleeping either. The other teachers walked past giving me curious looks, probably wondering who this young woman was waiting by my car. Jessica pushed off the door when she saw me, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warm afternoon. She demanded to know what I wanted from her, her voice shaking between anger and something that might have been fear. She said she never meant to hurt me, that she didn't realize how serious things were with Craig. I unlocked my car and tossed my work bag in the back seat before responding. I told her that ignorance wasn't an excuse when you're calling yourself someone's work wife and accepting financial support from a married man. She stepped closer, blocking my driver's side door, insisting she needed to explain her side. Jessica tried to paint herself as the victim while parents picked up their kids 50 feet away. She said Craig pursued her, made her think his marriage was basically over, told her I didn't understand him. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd saved, screenshots of Craig's credit card statements from the past 6 months. I held the screen up so she could see every lunch and coffee he'd bought her, every charge at restaurants he'd told me were business meetings. I scrolled through them slowly, highlighting the dates when he'd come home and told me we needed to budget more carefully. Her face went pale as she realized how much documentation I had, how carefully I'd been paying attention while they both assumed I was too serious and too busy with finger painting to notice. She stopped talking, her mouth opening and closing without sound, and I told her to move away from my car. She did, stepping back onto the sidewalk while I climbed in and drove away without looking back. The email from Faisal arrived the next morning while I was setting up art supplies for my class. The subject line said HR investigation meeting request, and my stomach dropped, so fast I had to sit down at my desk. Making this official meant there was no going back, no pretending this was just a scare tactic to make Craig and Jessica understand consequences. Part of me felt guilty for potentially destroying Craig's career, for being the person who reported him and set all this in motion. I texted Lila during my lunch break, telling her about the email and the guilt eating at me. She wrote back immediately, reminding me that Craig destroyed his own career by violating company policy. She said I was just holding him accountable for choices he made every single day for months. Faisal's office was smaller than I expected, with generic corporate art on the walls and a desk covered in neat stacks of folders. He stood when I walked in 2 days later, shaking my hand with a firm grip and gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I'd brought everything in a large envelope, the co-signed lease documents, printed text messages between Craig and Jessica, even a written account of Craig's drunken confession about their emotional affair. Faisal opened the envelope carefully, spreading the documents across his desk like evidence at a crime scene. His face stayed professional, but I could see the concern growing as he read through everything, especially when he got to the financial entanglement between a senior employee and junior subordinate. He explained the investigation would take 2 to 3 weeks, that both Craig and Jessica would be interviewed separately, that I might need to answer follow-up questions. I nodded and signed the formal complaint form, my hand steady even though my heart was racing. When I left his office, the envelope stayed behind on his desk, and I knew I'd just made everything real in a way that couldn't be undone. I spent 3 days at Lila's place before going back to the house for more of my things. Craig's car sat in the driveway when I pulled up, which meant he'd taken time off work or was working from home. I grabbed empty boxes from my trunk and let myself in through the front door, heading straight for the bedroom without calling out to him. My hands moved quickly through the closet, pulling clothes off hangers and folding them into boxes while my heart hammered against my ribs. I heard his footsteps on the stairs before I saw him, heavy and deliberate, and when he appeared in the doorway, his face was red with anger instead of the apology I'd half expected. He blocked the exit with his body and started yelling about how I was ruining his life over a friendship, how Jessica was just a coworker, and I was blowing everything out of proportion. I kept folding clothes while he talked, not looking at him, letting his words wash over me without response. He got louder when I didn't react, accusing me of filing false reports with HR and trying to get them both fired out of spite. I finally stopped packing and turned to face him, my voice calm and steady when I pointed out that if Jessica was just a friend, he wouldn't have told her about my miscarriage or our mortgage or every argument we'd ever had. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out, his face going from red to pale as my words sank in. I went back to packing while he stood there in silence. Then he tried a completely different approach, his voice suddenly soft and apologetic. He said he was drunk and stupid at the Christmas party, that he didn't mean any of the things he said about Jessica being an upgrade. I pulled open my dresser drawer and started removing clothes without looking at him, asking about the other 364 days of the year when he came home talking about Jessica constantly. I asked about all the times I'd told him I was uncomfortable with their relationship, and he'd called me insecure and told me to stop overreacting. I asked about the months of dismissing my feelings and making me think I was crazy for being bothered by his work wife. He had no real answer, just more excuses about work stress and how Jessica was easy to talk to because she understood his professional life. I taped up the box I'd filled and started on another one, telling him that his excuses didn't change what he'd done or how he'd made me feel for months. He followed me around the bedroom while I packed, trying different angles and approaches. But I kept my responses short and focused on getting my things together. By the time I'd filled 4 boxes with clothes and personal items, he'd gone quiet again, just watching me with this wounded expression like I was the villain in our story. I loaded the boxes into my car while Craig stood in the doorway watching, then went back inside for one more trip. He was sitting on the couch when I came back down with my laptop and some books, his head in his hands, but I walked past him without stopping. Before I left, I turned around and told him he had 2 weeks to decide if he wanted to contest the divorce or accept the settlement terms, and that the HR investigation would continue no matter what he chose. He looked up at me then with something like desperation in his eyes, but I walked out and closed the door behind me without waiting for a response. Back at Lila's apartment, I unpacked my boxes into the guest room she'd cleared out for me, hanging clothes in the small closet and stacking books on the nightstand. My phone rang while I was organizing my things, and I didn't recognize the number, so I let it go to voicemail. When I checked the message later, Jessica's voice came through the speaker, shaky and tearful, begging me to call her back. I deleted it without listening to the whole thing and went back to unpacking. She called again an hour later from the same blocked number, and this time I answered on the 3rd ring. Her words came out in a rush, crying and saying she couldn't afford to lose her job, that she had student loans and rent and couldn't survive on unemployment. I felt a quick flash of sympathy before remembering how excited she'd looked at dinner when she thought marrying Craig meant financial security without consequences. I told her she should have thought about employment issues before building her entire life around financial support from a married man who was senior to her at work. She started to argue, saying it wasn't like that, but I hung up before she could finish her sentence. Lila came home from the school while I was sitting on the guest bed staring at my phone, and she took one look at my face and asked what happened. I told her about Craig's anger and Jessica's desperate phone call, and she sat down next to me on the bed while I talked through everything. She listened without interrupting until I was done, then asked if I thought I was being too harsh by not withdrawing the HR complaint. I thought about it for a minute, really considered the question instead of just reacting, then told her that both Craig and Jessica made choices knowing they were crossing boundaries. Craig chose to co-sign Jessica's lease and drive her to work every day, and cover her lunches while telling me we needed to budget more carefully. Jessica chose to accept all that help and call herself his work wife, and share details about his marriage that should have stayed private. Lila nodded and pointed out that I wasn't responsible for protecting them from consequences they created through their own actions. She reminded me that company policies exist for exactly this kind of situation, to prevent senior employees from creating inappropriate relationships with junior staff that could lead to favoritism or worse. We talked for another hour about whether consequences were the same as revenge, and whether I was doing this for justice or just to hurt them back. I admitted I didn't know anymore. That part of me wanted them to understand how their choices affected other people, but another part of me just wanted them to hurt the way I'd been hurting for months. Lila said both things could be true at the same time, that I could want accountability and also want them to suffer, and that didn't make me a bad person. She ordered pizza for dinner and we ate while watching reality TV, not talking about Craig or Jessica or divorce papers, just existing in the moment without all the heavy stuff weighing on us. 2 weeks passed in a blur of teaching kindergarten during the day and staying at Lila's apartment at night. I'd started to relax into a routine when Ambrosia called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was cleaning up paint supplies after art time. She said Craig had contacted her office wanting to negotiate the divorce terms instead of contesting them, which meant he'd accepted that this was really happening. I felt something loosen in my chest at that news, relief mixed with sadness that our marriage was officially ending. Then Ambrosia explained his proposed terms, and the relief disappeared. Craig wanted me to take 40% of our assets instead of 50%, in exchange for withdrawing the HR complaint against him and Jessica. I actually laughed out loud in my empty classroom, a bitter sound that surprised me with its harshness. I told Ambrosia he still didn't understand that this wasn't about money or revenge. It was about respect and accountability for choices he made every single day for months. She asked if I wanted to hear the full proposal before deciding, and I said no. Tell him I want the 50-50 split as originally outlined, and the HR investigation would proceed on its own timeline. She said she'd pass along my response and warned me that Craig might not take it well, but I told her I didn't care how he took it anymore. That evening, I was helping Lila make dinner when someone started pounding on her apartment door hard enough to rattle the frame. Lila's boyfriend was there too, and he answered it while we stood back in the kitchen, and I heard Craig's voice immediately, loud and angry, and demanding to know why I was being so unreasonable. Lila's boyfriend is tall and broad-shouldered, and he filled the doorway completely, telling Craig in a calm but firm voice to leave, or he'd call the police. Craig tried to push past him to get to me, but Lila's boyfriend didn't move, just repeated that Craig needed to leave the property now. I stayed in the kitchen with Lila, my hands shaking while I gripped the counter, listening to Craig yell about how I was destroying his life and taking everything he'd worked for. Lila's boyfriend pulled out his phone and started dialing, and that's when Craig finally backed off, his voice fading as he walked away down the hallway. We heard his car start in the parking lot a minute later, the engine revving too loud before he drove away. Lila's boyfriend came back inside and locked the door behind him, asking if I was okay, and I nodded even though I wasn't sure it was true. The three of us sat down to eat the dinner we'd made, but I couldn't taste anything. My mind stuck on Craig's anger and the realization that he finally understood I was serious about the divorce. The next morning, Ambrosia called again to schedule a meeting about the financial details of the divorce, and I took a personal day from the school to meet her at her office downtown. She spread papers across her desk showing our joint accounts, the house value, retirement funds, and everything else we'd built together over 8 years. Half of everything sounded fair and reasonable when she first explained it weeks ago, but seeing the actual numbers made my stomach drop. Selling the house meant losing the place where I'd thought I'd raise kids someday, where I'd painted the walls and planted flowers and built a life. Splitting the retirement accounts meant starting over financially at 35, rebuilding savings and security from scratch. Ambrosia walked me through each line item with professional efficiency, explaining timelines and tax implications and legal requirements, but my mind kept wandering to the bigger picture. I'd be living in a smaller apartment, watching my budget carefully, maybe working summer school to make ends meet. The panic started in my chest and spread outward, making my hands shake and my breathing shallow, and I had to ask Ambrosia to stop talking for a minute while I pulled myself together. She got me a glass of water and waited patiently while I drank it and tried to calm down. The panic wanted to turn into regret, wanted me to wonder if I was making a huge mistake by ending my marriage over hurt feelings and wounded pride. Then I remembered Craig drunk at the Christmas party saying Jessica was an upgrade, calling her superior to me in every way that mattered to him, and the panic shifted back to determination. I told Ambrosia to proceed with everything as planned, that I wanted the 50-50 split, and I wasn't interested in any more of Craig's negotiations. The following week, Faisal from HR called and asked if I could come in for a follow-up interview about the investigation. I met him at a coffee shop near his office since I didn't want to go to Craig's workplace, and he had a folder full of notes and printed emails when I sat down across from him. He asked detailed questions about the timeline of Craig and Jessica's relationship, when I first noticed the financial arrangements and what Craig's exact position was in the company hierarchy. I answered everything as clearly as I could, providing dates and examples and showing him more screenshots from Craig's credit card statements. Faisal made notes while I talked, his expression neutral and professional. Then he told me something that surprised me. Jessica had tried to claim Craig forced the financial arrangements on her, that she'd felt pressured to accept his help because he was senior to her, even though he wasn't her direct supervisor. But text messages between them showed a different story, with Jessica actively requesting his help with the lease and asking him to cover lunches she promised to pay back later. Faisal said the investigation was revealing a pattern of inappropriate boundary violations on both sides, not coercion from Craig alone. I felt a weird mix of vindication and discomfort hearing that, glad the truth was coming out but also aware that I'd set this whole process in motion. Faisal thanked me for my time and cooperation, then mentioned that the investigation would conclude within the next week with formal findings and recommendations. I left the coffee shop feeling drained and went home to Lila's apartment where I took a long nap to escape thinking about everything for a while. 3 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman's voice asked if this was Craig's wife. I said yes cautiously, and she introduced herself as Craig's mother, her tone already sharp with disapproval. She said Craig had told them everything about the divorce and the HR complaint, and she wanted to understand why I was throwing away 8 years of family over a misunderstanding. I felt my jaw tighten at the word misunderstanding, like Craig's months of emotional infidelity and policy violations were just some small confusion we could laugh about later. She kept talking without waiting for my response, reminding me of all the family holidays we'd spent together and asking if I really wanted to lose all those relationships and memories. Her voice took on this guilt-heavy tone that probably worked on Craig when he was a kid, but it just made me angry listening to it now. I interrupted her mid-sentence and told her that her son called another woman an upgrade from me, that he shared intimate details of our marriage, including my miscarriage with his coworker, that he violated company policy by financially supporting a junior employee. She went quiet for a second, then said I must have misunderstood what Craig meant, that he'd been drinking and didn't mean those things the way they sounded. I asked her point blank if she'd stay married to someone who called her inferior to another woman while building an emotional affair behind her back. She didn't answer that question, just said I was being vindictive and destroying her son's career out of spite instead of working on the marriage like an adult. I told her that her son called another woman an upgrade from me, that he shared intimate details of our marriage, including my miscarriage, with his coworker, that he violated company policy by financially supporting a junior employee. She went quiet for a second, then said I must have misunderstood what Craig meant, that he'd been drinking and didn't mean those things the way they sounded. I asked her point blank if she'd stay married to someone who called her inferior to another woman while building an emotional affair behind her back. She didn't answer that question, just said I was being vindictive and destroying her son's career out of spite instead of working on the marriage like an adult. The anger I'd been holding back finally broke through, and I raised my voice asking what exactly I was supposed to work on when Craig spent months telling another woman she was better than me. She started talking over me about family loyalty and commitment through hard times, and I cut her off mid-sentence. I explained that Craig destroyed his own career by co-signing leases and covering expenses for a junior employee, which violated company policy regardless of how I felt about it. If he'd respected our marriage and followed workplace rules, none of this would be happening right now. She made a disgusted sound and said she didn't raise her son to be treated like this by someone who gave up at the first sign of trouble. I felt my hands shaking from frustration, but kept my voice steady, telling her that 8 years and months of dismissing my concerns wasn't the first sign of trouble. It was the final sign that Craig didn't respect me. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat there staring at my phone, feeling both guilty for yelling at her and relieved that I'd stood up for myself instead of accepting her blame. 3 weeks passed with me staying at Lila's apartment and trying to focus on teaching while the HR investigation continued. My phone rang one afternoon during my lunch break, and I saw it was Faisal calling with the investigation results. I stepped into the hallway outside my classroom and answered with my heart beating fast. Faisal's voice was professional and measured as he explained that the investigation found multiple policy violations, including inappropriate financial arrangements between employees at different seniority levels. Craig was placed on administrative leave pending final review by upper management, and Jessica was transferred to a different department with a formal warning in her file. I'd expected them both to be fired based on what Faisal had said about company policy, so this outcome surprised me. He explained that since Craig wasn't Jessica's direct supervisor, and the financial arrangements happened outside work hours, they couldn't justify immediate termination, but the violations were serious enough to warrant significant consequences. I thanked him for the update and hung up feeling strange about the whole thing. Part of me felt vindicated that the investigation confirmed what I'd reported, but another part felt guilty that Craig's career was damaged even if he'd brought it on himself. I drove to Lila's apartment after work and found her making dinner in the kitchen. She took one look at my face and asked what happened, so I told her about the HR decision while helping her chop vegetables. Lila reminded me that I didn't make Craig co-sign Jessica's lease or cover her lunch expenses or share intimate details about our marriage and miscarriage. All I did was document what they chose to do and report it to the appropriate people at his company. She pointed out that if Craig and Jessica had followed basic professional boundaries, none of this would have happened. I knew she was right, but it still felt heavy knowing my actions contributed to real consequences that would affect both their careers for years. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Craig saying I'd gotten what I wanted and destroyed his reputation at work. I stared at the message, feeling angry that he still didn't understand this wasn't about revenge. I typed back that he destroyed his own reputation by prioritizing his work wife over his actual wife and violating company policy. He didn't reply, and I realized this was probably the end of any civil communication between us. The next morning, I woke up to a Facebook message request from someone named Adriana, who I didn't recognize. I opened it and saw she was Jessica's roommate based on her profile picture showing both of them at their apartment. Her message was angry and direct, saying she was stuck with a lease she couldn't afford because Craig stopped helping Jessica with rent. She blamed me for ruining Jessica's financial situation and demanded to know how I planned to fix the mess I'd created. I read the message twice, feeling bad for Adriana, who got dragged into this situation through no fault of her own. But I also recognized that Jessica created this dependency on Craig's financial support and now had to figure out how to be independent. I wrote back a short response saying I was sorry she was dealing with this, but Jessica's financial choices weren't my responsibility, and I wouldn't be offering help or apology. Adriana sent back several angry messages calling me selfish and heartless, but I deleted the conversation and blocked her profile. A month had passed since the confrontation dinner, and I was having trouble sleeping most nights. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning thinking about Craig's drunken words, or Jessica's face when she realized the financial reality, or Adriana stuck with a lease she couldn't afford. During the day, I functioned fine teaching my kindergarten class, but at night the emotional toll caught up with me. Lila suggested I talk to someone professional instead of just processing everything with her over wine. I made an appointment with a therapist named Dr. Miller, who had availability the following week. Sitting in her office that first session, I felt nervous about opening up to a stranger, but she made it easy by asking simple questions about what brought me in, I explained the whole situation, starting with Craig's Christmas party confession and ending with the HR investigation results. Dr. Miller listened without judgment and then helped me identify the complicated feelings I'd been avoiding: anger at Craig's betrayal, guilt about the consequences my actions caused, grief for the marriage I thought I had. She pointed out that I'd been so focused on strategic responses and documentation that I hadn't let myself actually feel the hurt underneath. Over the next few sessions, we worked on processing those emotions instead of just pushing them aside. During one appointment, I admitted something I'd barely let myself think, which was that part of me still loved Craig, or at least loved who I thought he was before all this happened. Dr. Miller helped me see that I could grieve the relationship while still knowing divorce was the right choice. The person who called me too serious and said Jessica understood him better wasn't someone I could trust with my heart, even if I missed parts of our life together. 2 days after that therapy session, Craig sent me a long email with the subject line, "Please read." I opened it during my planning period at the school and read through his apology and request for another chance. He promised he'd cut off all contact with Jessica and would do whatever it took to rebuild my trust. I read the email 3 times looking for genuine understanding of what he'd done wrong. All I found were excuses about work stress and how Jessica made him feel appreciated when he was having a hard time. He promised to do better and go to marriage counseling, but never acknowledged the fundamental disrespect he showed me for months. The email focused on his feelings and his struggles without really addressing how his actions affected me. I saved the email to my drafts folder and spent the rest of the day thinking about how to respond. That evening, I wrote back a shorter email explaining that this wasn't about Jessica specifically, even though she was part of it. The real issue was how he talked about me to her, dismissed my feelings when I raised concerns, and built an emotional closeness with someone else while calling me insecure for noticing. I told him I needed a partner who respected me even when I wasn't in the room, and he'd proven over months that he wasn't that person. His drunken confession at Christmas just made obvious what had been true for a while. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and then turned off my phone for the night. 6 weeks after the confrontation dinner, Craig's parents called asking me to meet them for dinner to talk things through as a family. I almost said no, but decided one final conversation might provide closure. I told them I'd meet them at a restaurant downtown and asked if I could bring Lila for support. Craig's mother sounded annoyed about that, but agreed. The night of the dinner, I dressed carefully in nice jeans and a sweater, wanting to look put together and confident. Lila drove us to the restaurant and squeezed my hand before we walked inside. Craig's parents were already seated at a corner booth looking serious and uncomfortable. His father stood to hug me, but his mother just nodded stiffly. We ordered drinks and appetizers while making awkward small talk about the weather and my teaching job. Then Craig's father cleared his throat and said he wanted to understand my perspective on everything that happened. He suggested marriage counseling and a fresh start, saying every marriage goes through rough patches. I appreciated that he was trying to be fair, but his mother couldn't help making pointed comments about me being unforgiving and throwing away 8 years over a misunderstanding. I set down my water glass and looked directly at Craig's mother. Her lips were pressed together in that way she had when she disapproved of something, but didn't want to say it outright. I took a breath and started listing everything Craig had said about me that night after the Christmas party. How I was too serious and didn't laugh at his jokes. How I didn't understand his real personality because I wasn't part of his work life. How Jessica was better suited to his needs because she brought him coffee and remembered his presentations. How he'd married the wrong type of woman. Craig's father stopped cutting his steak and stared at me with his mouth slightly open. His mother started shaking her head before I even finished. She waved her hand in the air and said Craig was drunk and people say stupid things when they're drunk. I leaned forward and asked her a simple question. Would she stay with Craig's father if he spent months building an emotional relationship with a younger woman, told that woman all their private business, including medical issues, helped her financially, drove her to work every day, and then came home drunk one night to say the other woman was an upgrade? Would she forgive that because he was drunk when he finally admitted what he'd been thinking for months? The table went quiet. Craig's father cleared his throat and looked at his wife, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. Lila squeezed my hand under the table. Craig's mother's face turned red and she said I was twisting things to make Craig look worse than he was. She said every marriage had rough patches and I was being unforgiving. I felt something snap inside me. I asked her how many rough patches were included your husband violating company policy to financially support another woman. How many were included him sharing details about your miscarriage with his coworker? How many were included him calling you inferior to someone half your age? She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Craig's father rubbed his face with both hands and said he didn't know it had gone that far. His mother recovered and said I was being cold and calculating by documenting everything, that I'd set Craig up by inviting Jessica to dinner and trapping them both. I stood up from the table because I was done. I told her the only reason anyone believed me was because I had documentation. Craig had spent months making me feel crazy for being uncomfortable with Jessica. He'd called me insecure and jealous and told me I was overreacting. Without proof, everyone would have taken his side and said I was imagining things. The documentation wasn't a trap. It was protection. Lila stood up with me and put money on the table for our meals. Craig's mother called after us saying we were being dramatic, and couldn't we just sit down and talk like adults? I turned back and told her I'd tried talking to Craig for months, and he'd dismissed me every time. I was done talking. Lila and I walked out of the restaurant into the cold parking lot. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the car. Lila got in the passenger seat and we sat there for a minute in silence. I felt exhausted but also lighter somehow. I'd stood up for myself with his family and said everything I needed to say. Whether they believed me or not didn't matter anymore. 2 months crawled by with lawyers sending papers back and forth. Ambrosia called one Tuesday morning to say the mediation was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. I took a personal day from the school and spent an hour that morning picking out clothes that made me look professional and put together. The mediation office was in a building downtown with gray carpet and bland artwork on the walls. Ambrosia met me in the lobby wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. She squeezed my shoulder and said to let her do most of the talking. We walked into a conference room with a long table. Craig was already there with his lawyer, a man named something I immediately forgot. Craig looked terrible. He'd lost weight and had dark circles under his eyes. His shirt was wrinkled like he'd pulled it out of the laundry basket. Our eyes met for a second and he looked away. The mediator introduced herself and explained the process. I only half listened because I was thinking about how Craig and I used to share a bed every night, and now we were sitting across a table from each other with lawyers in between. The mediator asked about our assets, and Ambrosia started going through the list. The house, the retirement accounts, the savings, the cars. Craig's lawyer interrupted to say they wanted to discuss the division percentages. Craig spoke up for the first time and said he should get more than 50% of the retirement accounts because he'd earned them through his job. Ambrosia didn't even look surprised. She pulled out a folder and started listing all the ways I'd supported Craig's career. How I'd worked full-time as a teacher while managing our household. How I'd attended his company events and hosted his coworkers for dinner. How I'd supported him through 2 job changes and a period of unemployment 3 years ago. How I'd delayed my own career advancement to accommodate his schedule. Craig's lawyer tried to argue, but Ambrosia had documentation for everything. Pay stubs showing I'd contributed to our household income consistently. Emails from Craig thanking me for handling things at home so he could focus on work. Photos from company events where I'd played the supportive wife. Craig slumped in his chair and stopped arguing. The mediator moved on to the house. Craig suddenly got animated again and said he wanted to keep it. He'd buy out my share and I could take the cash. I said no immediately. The mediator asked why, and I explained I didn't trust Craig to actually pay me. After everything that happened, I needed a clean break with no ongoing financial ties. Craig's face turned red and he said I was being unreasonable. His lawyer suggested putting the buyout terms in writing with penalties if Craig defaulted. I still said no. I wanted the house sold and the money split down the middle. Craig started arguing that the house was his home, and I was trying to take it from him out of spite. Ambrosia cut in and said the house was marital property, and I had every right to request a sale. The mediator suggested we table the house discussion and move to other assets. Craig and his lawyer had a whispered conversation. The tension in the room made my shoulders tight. I realized this was going to take multiple sessions. We weren't going to resolve everything today. The first mediation session ended after 2 hours with almost nothing decided. I walked to my car in the parking garage and sat in the driver's seat with the door closed. Then I started crying. Not the angry crying from before, but exhausted, frustrated crying. This was so much harder than I'd expected. The strategic confrontation dinner had felt powerful and controlled. This mediation process was messy and slow and expensive. Every hour with Ambrosia cost money I didn't really have. Every session meant taking time off work and sitting across from Craig while we picked apart 8 years of our lives. I wanted it to be over, but we'd barely started. My phone buzzed with a text from Lila asking how it went. I didn't have the energy to respond. I drove back to her apartment and went straight to the guest room. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about how naive I'd been. I thought once I confronted Craig and filed for divorce, the hard part would be over. But the hard part was just beginning. All the legal processes and paperwork and negotiations stretched out ahead of me like an endless road. Lila knocked on the guest room door around 6 and said she was taking me out for dinner. I said I wasn't hungry, but she ignored me and told me to get dressed. We went to a small restaurant near her apartment that served comfort food. Lila ordered for both of us and then made me talk through the mediation session. I told her about Craig fighting over the retirement accounts and the house. How he'd looked terrible but still found the energy to argue about money. How the mediator had suggested tabling discussions because we couldn't agree on anything. Lila listened and then said something that surprised me. She said messy doesn't mean wrong. I was fighting for fair treatment and financial security, not trying to punish Craig. The fact that he was making it difficult said more about him than about me. I picked at my food and said it didn't feel that simple. Lila shook her head and reminded me why I'd started this whole process. Because Craig had disrespected me for months. Because he'd built an inappropriate relationship with Jessica and dismissed my concerns. Because he'd called me inferior to another woman. She said I deserved someone who valued me and respected me even when I wasn't in the room. Craig had proven he wasn't that person. Fighting for a fair divorce settlement wasn't vindictive. It was self-respect. I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Lila was right. I wasn't the one making this difficult. Craig was fighting because he didn't want to face the full consequences of his choices. I was just refusing to make it easy for him. 3 months after the confrontation dinner, Ambrosia called with news about Craig's job situation. His administrative leave had ended and the company had made their decision. He wasn't fired like Jessica had feared during that dinner. Instead, he was demoted from his senior position and transferred to a different office location across town. It was a real consequence that would affect his earning potential and career trajectory. I sat with that information for a while trying to figure out how I felt. Part of me felt satisfied that Craig faced professional consequences for violating company policy. He'd co-signed Jessica's lease, driven her to work daily, covered her expenses, and shared intimate details about our marriage. Those weren't just personal choices, they were policy violations. But another part of me felt complicated about it. I'd filed that HR complaint knowing it could cost Craig his job. The demotion was better than firing, but it was still a significant setback. I wondered if I'd been too harsh. Then I remembered Craig saying Jessica was an upgrade and the guilt faded. He'd made choices knowing they violated policy. He'd prioritized his relationship with Jessica over his marriage and his career. I'd just documented what he chose to do. A Facebook message notification popped up on my phone while I was planning lessons at the school. It was from Jessica. I stared at her profile picture for a second before opening the message. She'd written 3 paragraphs saying she hoped I was happy now that both their careers were damaged. That Craig had been demoted and transferred because of my complaint. That she'd been moved to a different department with a formal warning on her record. That I'd gotten my revenge and ruined 2 lives. I read it twice and then closed the app without responding. Jessica was still refusing to take responsibility for her own choices. She could have said no when Craig offered to co-sign her lease. She could have maintained professional boundaries instead of accepting daily rides and free lunches. She could have not called herself Craig's work wife in front of me at the company picnic. Every choice she made had led to these consequences. I didn't force her to build a financially dependent relationship with a married man. I just reported what she chose to do. The message bothered me for the rest of the day anyway. Not because I felt guilty, but because Jessica genuinely seemed to believe she was a victim in all this. That Craig's wife documenting their inappropriate relationship was somehow worse than the relationship itself. I thought about responding and explaining that professional boundaries exist for a reason. That accepting financial support from a senior colleague creates exactly this kind of problem. But I deleted the message instead. Jessica wasn't going to hear anything I had to say. The second mediation session happened 2 weeks later. Craig and I were both quieter this time, worn down from fighting. His lawyer suggested we focus on areas where we might find agreement. We went through the list of assets again. The house still needed to be resolved, but we agreed to sell it and split the money. The retirement accounts would be divided according to standard formulas that Ambrosia and Craig's lawyer had researched. Our bank accounts would be separated with each of us keeping what was currently in our individual accounts. Craig asked about some furniture that had belonged to his grandmother. A dining table and chairs that we'd kept in storage because they didn't fit our house. I agreed he could have them. He looked surprised and said thank you quietly. His lawyer asked about a few other items with sentimental value and I agreed to most of them. I didn't want to fight over every lamp and chair. The mediator seemed relieved that we were making progress. She scheduled another session for the following month to finalize remaining details. Craig and I walked out of the building at the same time. We stood in the parking lot for an awkward moment. He started to say something but stopped. I waited, but he just shook his head and walked to his car. I watched him drive away and felt sad about how we'd ended up here. 2 people who'd promised to spend their lives together now couldn't even have a conversation in a parking lot. I started scrolling through apartment listings on my phone during my lunch break, watching the prices and square footage blur together into depressing numbers. Everything in my budget looked small and far from the school where I taught. Studios with kitchenettes barely bigger than my current pantry. 1-bedrooms in buildings with peeling paint and reviews mentioning roaches. The reality of starting over financially hit me hard as I calculated what I could actually afford on a kindergarten teacher's salary without Craig's income. I'd be living in a smaller space, watching my money more carefully, rebuilding a life I thought was settled 8 years ago. My therapist's voice played in my head from our last session, reminding me that I was also gaining freedom from a relationship where I wasn't respected. That freedom felt abstract compared to the concrete problem of finding somewhere to live that didn't require me to choose between paying rent and eating. I bookmarked 3 apartments that seemed okay and closed the app before I could spiral further into panic about my shrinking budget. The next day at the school, one of the other kindergarten teachers asked why I was looking at apartments. She'd noticed me scrolling through listings during recess duty while the kids played on the swings. I gave a vague answer about divorce, keeping my voice neutral because I didn't want to get into details about work wives and emotional affairs. She nodded and told me she'd gone through something similar 5 years ago, leaving a marriage where she felt invisible and unappreciated. She said it was the best decision she ever made, even though the first year was hard financially and emotionally. Hearing that someone came out better on the other side gave me hope that this pain wasn't permanent, that someday I'd look back and feel grateful I left instead of staying with someone who compared me unfavorably to his coworker. She offered to help me move when the time came, and I thanked her, surprised by how much that small offer of practical support meant. Craig called me directly that evening instead of going through our lawyers, his number showing up on my phone after weeks of communicating only through Ambrosia. I stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering, already knowing I was making a mistake. He asked if we could talk in person, his voice careful and measured in a way that made him sound like a stranger. Against my better judgment and definitely against Ambrosia's advice from our last meeting, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop halfway between his new apartment and Lila's place. I told myself I could handle one conversation without falling apart or changing my mind about the divorce. The coffee shop was neutral territory, public enough that neither of us could make a scene. When I arrived, Craig was already sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee, one pushed across to my usual seat. He looked different, older and more tired, with lines around his eyes I didn't remember being so deep. I wondered if I looked the same way, marked by months of fighting and paperwork and sleepless nights processing the end of everything we'd built together. Craig started talking before I even sat down fully, telling me he'd been in therapy for the past 6 weeks. His therapist was helping him understand what he did wrong, how he'd built an inappropriate relationship with Jessica, and dismissed my feelings repeatedly. He acknowledged that he'd disrespected me in ways that violated our marriage, sharing intimate details with someone else while making me feel crazy for being uncomfortable. The words sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech multiple times before meeting me. I appreciated hearing him take responsibility, but the apology felt too late, like he only understood the damage now that he was facing real consequences. He wouldn't have gone to therapy if I hadn't filed for divorce and reported him to HR. He wouldn't have realized Jessica was inappropriate if she hadn't dumped him when his financial situation changed. The understanding came from losing everything, not from actually caring about how he'd made me feel for months before the confrontation. I told Craig that I believed he was sorry, but sorry doesn't rebuild trust that took months to destroy. Each dismissal of my concerns, each comparison to Jessica, each time he made me feel inferior, had chipped away at something fundamental between us. He nodded slowly and admitted he didn't expect me to take him back. He just wanted me to know he understands now what he threw away. We sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment, both holding coffee cups we weren't drinking, surrounded by the normal sounds of other people having easier conversations. I thanked him for the apology and stood up to leave, needing to get out before the weight of everything made me cry in public. He didn't try to stop me or ask for another chance, just watched me walk away with this defeated look that made me feel sad despite everything he'd done. That night I cried harder than I had since the confrontation dinner, lying in Lila's guest bed and grieving the marriage and the future I thought we'd have. I'd been so focused on the practical aspects of divorce, the paperwork and mediation and apartment hunting, that I hadn't let myself fully process the emotional loss. My therapist explained during our next session that this was actually progress, that letting myself feel sad didn't mean I'd made the wrong choice. She said I'd been in survival mode for months, dealing with the immediate crisis, and now my brain was finally safe enough to process the deeper hurt. Crying about what I'd lost didn't cancel out knowing I'd made the right decision to leave. Both things could be true at the same time. 5 months after the confrontation dinner, the house sold quickly in a good market. The real estate agent called with an offer above asking price, and Ambrosia coordinated with Craig's lawyer to schedule the closing. I signed the papers feeling both relief and sadness, remembering when we bought the house together 8 years ago, full of hope about building a life in those rooms. Craig sat across the table at the title company, looking similarly emotional as we transferred ownership to strangers who'd make new memories in the space where our marriage had fallen apart. We were awkwardly polite to each other in a way that felt like strangers meeting for the first time, not two people who'd shared a bed and a mortgage and dreams about the future. The closing took less than an hour, and then I walked out with a check for my half of the proceeds, officially severing another connection between us. With my share of the house money, I put a deposit on a small but nice apartment closer to the school where I taught. The building was newer than most places in my original budget, with big windows that let in lots of light and a kitchen that actually had counter space. It was mine alone, decorated how I wanted, with no one dismissing my preferences or comparing my choices to someone else's better taste. I picked paint colors without asking anyone's opinion and bought furniture that I actually liked, instead of compromising on every decision. The freedom felt strange and scary and a little bit exciting, like learning to walk again after being injured. I scheduled the move for a Saturday when school was closed, giving myself a full weekend to get settled before facing my kindergarten class on Monday. Lila showed up early on moving day with her boyfriend and a borrowed truck, ready to help me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs. We spent the day unpacking and arranging furniture, debating where the couch should go and whether my bookshelf looked better by the window or against the wall. She brought cleaning supplies and helped me scrub down the kitchen before putting away dishes. Her boyfriend assembled my bed frame without complaining when the instructions turned out to be missing half the necessary information. By evening, the apartment looked almost livable, with most boxes unpacked and furniture roughly where I wanted it. Lila opened a bottle of wine when we were done and toasted to new beginnings, holding up her glass in my small living room. I felt genuinely happy for the first time in months, not because everything was perfect, but because I was building something that was authentically mine, a space where I could be myself without judgment or comparison. The final divorce papers arrived 6 weeks later, officially ending 8 years of marriage with my signature on legal documents. I sat at my new kitchen table and read through the decree, seeing our relationship reduced to asset division and settlement terms. I signed them with a mix of sadness and relief, acknowledging that this chapter was truly closed now. Then I took myself out for a nice dinner at a restaurant I'd always wanted to try, sitting alone at a table and ordering whatever I wanted without considering anyone else's preferences. I wasn't celebrating the divorce exactly, but I was acknowledging that I'd survived something hard and came out stronger on the other side. I'm pushing my cart through the produce section 2 weeks later when I see her buy the tomatoes. Jessica freezes with her hand halfway to a package, and we lock eyes across a display of bell peppers. She looks different without the professional polish, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. For a second, neither of us moves, both of us probably calculating whether we can pretend we didn't see each other. She opens her mouth like she's going to say something, then closes it again. Her face cycles through what looks like embarrassment, anger, and resignation, before settling on carefully blank. She gives me a tense nod, the kind you'd give a stranger you accidentally made eye contact with, then quickly grabs whatever tomatoes are closest and hurries toward the checkout lanes. I stand there holding my shopping list, watching her disappear around the corner display of canned goods. The anger I expected to feel doesn't come. Instead, I just feel tired of the whole mess, exhausted by months of drama and legal proceedings and emotional processing. I finish my shopping and drive home to my apartment, realizing somewhere between the dairy aisle and the parking lot that I don't want to waste any more energy thinking about her or what happened. My life is moving forward, and she's just someone I used to know through the worst period of my marriage. My therapist's office becomes a place where I slowly piece myself back together over the following weeks. We work on separating my identity from being Craig's wife, figuring out who I am when I'm not defined by that relationship. She asks me what I liked to do before I got married, what hobbies I gave up, what friendships I let fade because Craig didn't like my friends or didn't want to spend time with them. I realize I'd slowly made myself smaller to fit into his life, agreeing with his preferences and dismissing my own interests as less important. She suggests I try something I'd always wanted to do, but never made time for. Something just for me that has nothing to do with teaching or my old life with Craig. I remember always wanting to try pottery after seeing a class advertised at the community center years ago, but Craig said it was a waste of money for a hobby I'd probably quit. I sign up for a beginner pottery class that meets Tuesday evenings, spending my first session making a lumpy bowl that barely holds its shape. The instructor is patient and encouraging, showing me how to center the clay and use steady pressure. I'm terrible at it, but I love the feeling of creating something with my hands, the focus required to shape the spinning clay. Between therapy sessions, I start reaching out to friends I'd neglected during my marriage, people I'd slowly stopped calling because Craig found them boring or annoying. My college roommate is thrilled to hear from me, and we meet for lunch, catching up on years of life changes. She's divorced too, further along in her healing, and she tells me it gets easier, but takes longer than you expect. At the school, I throw myself into teaching with fresh energy, planning elaborate art projects and storytime activities that make my kindergartners excited to come to class. Slowly, week by week, I remember parts of myself I'd forgotten existed, and start discovering new interests I never had time to explore before. My phone buzzes with a text 6 months after the confrontation dinner, and Craig's name on the screen makes my stomach clench out of habit, before I remember I don't have to be afraid of what he thinks anymore. The message is short and almost formal, saying he's moving to the new office location in another city and hoping I'm doing well. I stare at the words for a long time, remembering 8 years of marriage and how we got from there to here. Part of me wants to ignore it. Another part wants to send something angry about everything he put me through. Instead, I type back a simple response wishing him well and meaning it more than I expected to. I don't wish him harm or want him to suffer. I just don't want him in my life anymore, taking up space in my head and my heart. The divorce taught me I can't control what he does or how he treats people. I can only control my own responses and choices. I hit send and then delete his contact information from my phone, one more small step toward moving on completely. That evening, I sit in my apartment eating dinner alone, and the silence feels peaceful instead of lonely like it used to. I've built a life that's mine, filled with pottery classes and reconnected friendships and kindergarten students who think I'm the best teacher ever. Craig moving away feels like the universe's way of giving me permission to close that chapter completely and focus on writing new ones. One of my students, a little girl named Ava with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, hands me a drawing during free playtime the next week. It's a crayon picture of a butterfly emerging from a cocoon, the butterfly colored in bright purple and pink with careful attention to detail. She tells me she learned about butterflies from a library book and wanted to draw one for me because I'm always nice to her. I thank her and pin it to my desk. But later that afternoon, I'm grading worksheets and I look at the drawing again and suddenly I'm crying. The metaphor hits me so hard I have to put down my pen and just sit with the emotion washing over me. Change is uncomfortable and sometimes painful, breaking out of the safe cocoon and becoming something new and vulnerable. But it's also how we grow into who we're meant to be, how we get wings and learn to fly instead of staying trapped in the dark safety of what we know. I think about who I was a year ago, unhappy but comfortable in my routine, ignoring Craig's emotional affair because confronting it meant risking everything. I think about who I'm becoming now, someone who sets boundaries and stands up for herself even when it's hard and scary. The butterfly is still drying its wings, still figuring out how to fly, but it's out of the cocoon and there's no going back. I take the picture home that evening and hang it on my refrigerator with a magnet, a daily reminder that transformation is worth the discomfort it takes to get there. Lila ambushes me with a setup 2 weeks later, telling me her boyfriend's friend is nice and recently single and they think we'd get along. I panic and try to back out, but she's already given him my number, and he's already texted asking if I want to meet for coffee. I spend 3 days anxious about it before finally agreeing to meet him Saturday morning at a cafe downtown. I change my outfit 4 times, worried about looking like I'm trying too hard or not trying enough, before settling on jeans and a sweater that feels casual but put together. He's waiting at a corner table when I arrive, standing up to shake my hand and introducing himself as Lucas. He's nice-looking in a normal way, with an easy smile and glasses, working as an accountant and telling me about his golden retriever named Biscuit. We talk for an hour about safe topics like work and hobbies and favorite movies, and he's pleasant and kind and I feel absolutely nothing. No spark, no attraction, no desire to see him again beyond basic politeness. When he suggests we do this again sometime, I'm honest and tell him I'm not ready for dating yet, that I'm still processing my divorce and figuring out who I am on my own. He takes it well and says he understands, wishes me luck, and we part as friendly acquaintances who will probably never see each other again. Walking back to my car, I realize I'm okay with how it went, okay with not feeling ready, okay with being single while I work on myself. There's no rush to find someone new, no pressure to fill the space Craig left with another relationship. I'm learning to be comfortable alone, and that feels like progress. The holidays arrive faster than expected, and I spend Thanksgiving with my parents and younger sister instead of Craig's family for the first time in 9 years. My mother makes too much food like always, and my sister brings her new boyfriend who's nervous and trying too hard to impress everyone. It feels both sad and freeing to be here without Craig, acknowledging the loss while also appreciating the freedom to just be myself, without worrying about his mood or his parents' subtle criticisms. After dinner, my mother pulls me aside while we're washing dishes and tells me she's proud of how I handled everything with dignity and strength. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that until the words hit me, and I'm fighting back tears over the soapy water. She says she watched me make myself smaller during the marriage, trying to be what Craig wanted instead of being myself, and she's glad to see me finding my way back. I spend Christmas with Lila and her family, joining their chaotic celebration with too many relatives and too much wine, and a white elephant gift exchange that gets competitive. Being included in someone else's family tradition feels both wonderful and a little lonely, reminding me that I'm building a new life but still missing pieces of my old one. Lila's mom treats me like one of her own kids, loading my plate with food and asking about my pottery class and telling embarrassing stories about Lila's teenage years. I drive home that evening feeling grateful for friends who become family when you need them most. The new semester starts in January, and I throw myself into teaching with energy I haven't felt in years. My classroom gets a fresh bulletin board display about winter animals, and I plan a unit on hibernation that includes making paper bag bear caves and reading stories about sleeping through the cold months. My students don't know anything about my divorce or the drama of the past year. They just know I'm their teacher who loves finger painting and does funny voices during story time. Having this part of my life that's completely untouched by everything that happened with Craig helps me feel normal and grounded. One of the parents tells me during pickup that her daughter talks about me constantly at home, saying I'm her favorite teacher ever. These small moments of connection and purpose remind me why I became a teacher in the first place, why I love working with 5-year-olds who still think the world is magical. My coworkers notice the change in me too, commenting that I seem happier and more relaxed this year. I don't tell them about the divorce or the work-wife situation or any of it. Just smile and say I'm in a good place. The classroom becomes my sanctuary, a space where I can focus on helping little humans learn and grow instead of processing my own mess. My principal calls me into her office in February with news about the annual raises, and I'm getting a small bump in salary based on my years of service and positive evaluations. It's not a huge amount, but it makes a real difference in my tight budget, giving me breathing room I haven't had since the divorce. I sit in my car after school doing mental math, calculating bills and expenses, and realizing I can actually manage comfortably now without the constant low-level panic about money. The financial fear that plagued me through the divorce proceedings starts to ease, replaced by cautious confidence in my ability to support myself independently. I'm not wealthy or comfortable by any means, still living paycheck to paycheck and watching my spending carefully, but I'm stable and making it work on my own. That evening, I treat myself to take out from my favorite Thai restaurant instead of cooking at home, a small celebration of financial progress. Eating pad thai on my couch in my own apartment that I pay for with my own salary feels like a bigger victory than it probably should. I text Lila to share the good news about the raise, and she responds with celebration emojis and a promise to take me out for drinks this weekend. The independence I was so terrified of during the divorce is becoming something I'm actually proud of, proof that I can take care of myself without relying on someone else. 7 months after the confrontation dinner, I wake up on a Tuesday morning and go through my usual routine of coffee and breakfast and getting ready for work. It's not until I'm driving to the school that I realize I didn't think about Craig or Jessica once the previous day. Not during my pottery class, not while making dinner, not while watching TV before bed. The realization hits me so suddenly I almost miss my turn, pulling into the school parking lot with this strange feeling of lightness. It's a small milestone, but it feels huge, proof that I'm genuinely moving forward instead of just surviving day to day. For months, they lived in my head constantly. Every decision filtered through the lens of the divorce and the betrayal and the anger. Now I'm having whole days where they don't even cross my mind, where I'm too busy living my own life to think about them at all. I text Lila during my lunch break to share this victory, and she sends back a string of celebration emojis and a message saying she's proud of me. My therapist later tells me this is a sign of real healing, that the emotional charge is fading, and they're becoming just people I used to know instead of the center of my world. I'm not completely over everything, still have hard days and moments of anger or sadness, but the balance is shifting toward peace more often than pain. My therapy appointment the following week focuses on whether I'm ready to reduce the frequency of our sessions. We've been meeting weekly since the confrontation, working through the divorce and the grief and the rebuilding, but my therapist thinks I'm doing well enough to try monthly check-ins instead. Part of me panics at the idea of less support, but another part recognizes that I'm not in crisis anymore, and I've built good coping skills and support systems. She reminds me that healing isn't linear, and I'll still have hard days or setbacks, but I've proven I can handle them without falling apart. We agree to try monthly sessions and see how it goes, with the understanding that I can always schedule extra appointments if I need them. Walking out of her office, I feel both proud and scared, like a kid learning to ride a bike without training wheels. The support is still there if I need it, but I'm ready to try managing more on my own. That evening, I update my calendar with the new therapy schedule and look at all the other things filling my time now. Pottery class, dinner with friends, school events, a weekend trip Lila and I are planning. My life is full in ways it wasn't during my marriage, busy with activities and people that make me feel like myself instead of just Craig's wife. I find a flyer at the community center 2 weeks later advertising a divorce support group that meets Thursday evenings. The meeting room smells like old coffee and has those uncomfortable plastic chairs arranged in a circle, and I almost turn around and leave before a woman about my age smiles and waves me over. Her name tag says facilitator, and she introduces herself as someone who's been divorced for 3 years and started this group to help others through the same process. There are 6 other people in the circle, all looking as nervous as I feel, and we go around sharing our stories. When it's my turn, I tell them about Craig and Jessica and the confrontation dinner, and several people nod like they recognize parts of their own experiences in mine. A man in his 40s talks about his wife leaving him for someone she met at the gym. A younger woman describes discovering her husband's affair through credit card statements. And an older woman shares how her marriage fell apart after her kids left for college. After the meeting, 3 people ask me specific questions about how I handled the legal process and documentation, and I realized that sharing what I learned might actually help someone else avoid mistakes or feel less alone. I sign up to come back next week and leave feeling lighter than I expected. Like talking about it with people who understand made it feel less heavy. I'm arranging flowers in a vase on my kitchen counter the following Tuesday, cheap grocery store daisies that I bought just because they looked cheerful, when the realization hits me. I'm happy. Not the forced kind of happy where you're trying to convince yourself everything is fine, but genuinely content with my life right now. The apartment is small, but it's decorated exactly how I want, without anyone telling me the colors are too bright or the furniture is impractical. I have pottery class tomorrow night and lunch plans with Lila on Saturday, and a stack of books I'm actually excited to read. The divorce forced me to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else needs, and what I found is someone I actually like. I learned to speak up when something bothers me instead of swallowing it down, to set boundaries without feeling guilty, to build a life based on what matters to me instead of what's expected. The woman arranging flowers in this apartment is stronger and more honest than the woman who lived in that house with Craig, and I wouldn't go back even if I could. I take a photo of the flowers and text it to Lila with a message about how good things are, and she responds with a heart emoji and "so proud of you." My email notification pings Friday afternoon. While I'm grading spelling tests, and I glance at my phone to see a message from Craig's company with the subject line, "Holiday Party Invitation." My finger hovers over it for a second before I realize it must have been sent to me by mistake, probably still in some old contact list from when I attended as Craig's wife. I delete it without opening and go back to marking papers, feeling nothing but mild irritation at the administrative error. 6 months ago, that email would have sent me spiraling, imagining Craig and Jessica at the party together, or wondering if people were talking about me. Now it's just digital clutter that takes 2 seconds to remove from my inbox. The fact that I don't care, that it doesn't even create a little twist in my stomach, shows me how much has changed. That chapter closed, and I'm not interested in reopening it even for a moment of curiosity. I finish the spelling tests, pack up my classroom, and drive home thinking about what to make for dinner, and whether I should start a new pottery project tonight. 8 months after that confrontation dinner, I'm sitting cross-legged on my living room floor working on a ceramic bowl that's probably going to crack in the kiln, but I'm making it anyway. My hands are covered in clay, and there's music playing from my phone, and the weekend trip itinerary Lila sent is pulled up on my laptop screen. We're going hiking in a state park 2 hours away, staying in a cabin and spending 2 days doing absolutely nothing productive. My life looks nothing like I imagined it would a year ago when I was married and living in that house and teaching kindergarten while trying to be the wife Craig wanted. This version is smaller in some ways, my apartment instead of a house, single income instead of 2, but it's completely mine in a way that matters more than square footage. I'm not perfectly healed, and I still have moments where I wonder if I'll ever fully trust someone again, but I'm building something real here. A life where I respect myself enough to demand respect from others, where I value my own needs instead of always putting someone else first, where I'm enough exactly as I am. The bowl wobbles a little under my hands and I steady it, shaping it into something that might be useful or might just be beautiful, and either way it'll be exactly what I meant to create.